I'm pleased today to welcome our own Dr. Al Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor of psychological science here at Ball State. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Alabama. She completed postdoctoral clinical training at the VA Palo Alto healthcare system. Today, she's going to be presenting a talk titled Psychopathy and Related Traits and Behaviors. So take it away, Dr. Johnson.
All right, thank you. All right, so we already know what I'm talking about, and let's see. All right, there we go. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of what I'm planning to cover in today's talk. So I'll first be starting from the assumption that not everybody in here has a background in psychopathy or has a limited background in psychopathy. So I'll be providing just some general information about what is psychopathy so that we can all start from the same page and have that as our foundation for moving forward. And then I'm going to switch to talking about a couple of previous studies that I've done and the relationship to current and future research that I'll be working on. And then, as Andy mentioned, I also plan to leave some time at the end for any questions that you have. But if, as we're going along, I say something that's not clear or could use more explanation in order to understand, then do please feel free to interrupt those questions as we go. And then with that in mind, I guess let's get started. Okay, so as I mentioned, I want to first provide a broad level understanding of psychopathy, and the conceptualization of psychopathy that you're seeing represented here is based on how psychopathy is operationalized by the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised. And what we're looking at is that psychopathy in this widely accepted operationalization consists of two related dimensions, and those are interpersonal and affective features, which is also sometimes known as factor 1, and features associated with a chronic antisocial lifestyle, which is also sometimes referred to as factor 2. These two factors are then further broken down into interpersonal and affective facets. That first interpersonal facet is referring to how a person interacts with other people. And as you can see, individuals high in psychopathic traits tend to interact in ways that are relatively superficial, reflect an inflated sense of their own self-worth, make a pattern out of lying or conning other people, and attempting to manipulate or charm others. Then the affective facet refers to people's interior emotional life. And as depicted here, people high in psychopathic traits are more likely to lack feelings of empathy for others or guilt over their own wrongdoings. They're more likely to have less rich or deep emotional lives and are less likely to take responsibility for their own actions. Then the chronic antisocial lifestyle domain is also broken down into two separate facets. And that lifestyle facet is referring to a pervasive tendency to require above average levels of stimulation to avoid boredom, living a life that relies on others to take responsible actions on their behalf, involves less long-term planning toward goals and more spur of the moment and irresponsible decisions and actions. And then lastly, the antisocial facet is describing a tendency to have less ability to inhibit or control their own actions, which can result in rule breaking or law breaking behavior. And then unsurprisingly, that leads to a tendency for people high in psychopathic traits to be more likely than average to experience legal problems. Often those can begin at an early age and result in increased criminal behavior and increased punishment for that criminal behavior. And it's also important to note that there is some continued debate about how to best conceptualize psychopathy. So an alternative model that has some similarities but is different from the one we just saw is the triarchic model of psychopathy. So in this model, boldness, meanness, and disinhibition are considered to be the key factors in psychopathy, with psychopathy residing at the intersection of those factors. And in this case, disinhibition is referring to some of the same lifestyle and affective traits that were included in the previous model. So these are things like impulsivity, irresponsibility, a lack of long-term planning, or an unwillingness to accept responsibility for one's actions. And then boldness is referring to some similar traits as we're seen in the interpersonal facet of the previous model, like superficial attempts to charm others, an inflated sense of self-worth, and willingness to take social risks in the form of attempts to con or manipulate other people. Meanness then refers to some of the same traits that were included in the affective facet of the previous conceptualization, like a lack of empathy for others, a lack of guilt or remorse for one's own wrongdoings. Another thing that I want to make sure to highlight, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is a book that's used by clinical psychologists and other mental health professionals to identify and classify mental disorders. And although this manual is not perfect and it undergoes regular critiques in the scientific literature and gets revised over time, it still is a relevant resource to consider when thinking about mental disorders. And of note, psychopathy, although it's widely studied by scientists, is not included in the main section of the current version of the DSM, which is the DSM-5. For adults, the closest disorder that's included in this manual is antisocial personality disorder. And although there are similarities between antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, there are also important differences that I'll talk about in a little bit. It's also would be inappropriate to identify or label psychopathy in a child. However, adults who display psychopathic traits generally display precursors to those traits in childhood. And the closest diagnosis in the DSM-5 that represents a child who's displaying early signs of the development of psychopathy is a diagnosis of conduct disorder with a specifier added for limited prosocial emotions. So specifiers in the DSM are additional information that is tagged on to the end of a diagnosis to help clarify and provide additional information about the disorder and about the symptoms that are present in that disorder. And for adults, although psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder are moderately correlated, and both disorders often include a lifelong pattern of antisocial behavior, they are distinct disorders. The diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder mostly focuses on a serious and repeated pattern of rule and law-breaking behavior, whereas psychopathy places more emphasis on emotional deficits and problems with interpersonal interactions. So as a result, about 80 to 90% of people who would meet criteria for a diagnosis of psychopathy would also meet criteria for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, whereas only about between 25 to 40% of people with a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder would meet the criteria for psychopathy. And if we take a look at this same model we saw previously, it can help explain why. So antisocial personality disorder is focused primarily on the chronic and antisocial lifestyle, the factor 2 traits and behaviors, and in particular, facet 4, the antisocial facet, whereas a diagnosis of psychopathy requires the presence of additional deficits, primarily those deficits that are listed over in factor 1 and have to do with somebody's internal emotional life and then how that impacts their interactions with other people. So just as a quick review, Antisocial personality disorder is listed in the DSM. Psychopathy is not. Antisocial personality disorder is primarily based in observable behaviors, whereas psychopathy includes a lot more emphasis on interpersonal and affective features in addition to those same behavioral components. And in antisocial personality disorder, the main thing we'd be looking at is a person who engages in repetitive, irresponsible, delinquent, unethical behaviors that doesn't show much concern for other people. Whereas in psychopathy, we'd be seeing those same behaviors, plus generally a lack of anxiety, a stunted range of emotions, and superficial and manipulative interactions. So unsurprisingly, again, because the criteria for psychopathy are essentially the criteria for antisocial personality disorder with some other considerations added in, around 2 to 4% of the general population is considered to meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder, whereas closer to 1% of the general population is considered to meet criteria for psychopathy. And then within an incarcerated population, those the percentages are even higher. So what we'd be looking at here is reflecting this idea of a couple things that we just talked about. So one is that while most people with psychopathy are going to also meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder, that same relationship doesn't work in reverse. So it's not the case that most people with antisocial personality disorder also meet criteria for psychopathy. And in both cases, a greater percentage of people who meet criteria for either of these labels or diagnoses are likely to be incarcerated in some way rather than residing in the community, although it's not the case that everybody who meets these criteria is not living in the community. So for some psychopathy research, for some psychopathy researchers, there's a great deal of interest in identifying similarities and differences in people high in psychopathic traits who don't end up being incarcerated, either because they effectively avoid being caught and punished, or because despite having traits such as being manipulative, lacking remorse, taking risks, acting irresponsibly, they channel these into avenues that don't actually result in criminal behavior. Although psychopathy has traditionally been classified as a personality disorder, there has been increasing evidence supporting viewing psychopathy and its precursors as a neurodevelopmental disorder in the same way that ADHD and autism are classified as neurodevelopmental disorders. And as this diagram shows, psychopathy is believed to develop from a complicated interaction between various genetic and biological factors combined with environmental factors that either cause underlying predispositions to emerge or exacerbate genetic and biological vulnerabilities. And there's really three main types of neurocognitive disruption that have been identified as being important for psychopathy. And these include emotional responsiveness or social affiliation, which refers to a tendency to be motivated to interact with others, to read cues that others are providing, and to respond to those cues in a way that society would deem to be an appropriate manner. The other deficit that is commonly seen in psychopathy is a deficit in reinforcement-based decision-making. And so this refers to the ability to consider pros and cons when making a decision and to change behavior based on feedback. So for example, based on punishment. And then lastly, differences in attention, with research indicating that people high in psychopathic traits have difficulty switching attention away from goal-oriented behavior, even when that behavior is no longer benefiting them. And there's also evidence that people high in psychopathy have difficulty attending to information that isn't seen as being directly relevant to their goals, which can help explain why less attention is paid to emotional cues from other people. And as mentioned before, it would be inappropriate to diagnose a child with psychopathy. At the same time, a neurodevelopmental view of psychopathy suggests that early intervention is one of the best tools for prevention. And so in children, that would be identified, what would be identified and then would be treated is the presence of callous and unemotional traits. So reasons why this is important to study. We've covered some of this already, but it's associated with criminal offending and then reoffending, including risks for recidivism of violent or sexual crimes. It's a risk factor for institutional problems, and the majority of people with psychopathic traits are residing in institutions, although not all. It's also associated with violence, including domestic violence, and it's associated with problems in education and employment, as well as increased substance use. Let's see. A couple just like pieces of terminology I want to clear up. So in children, what would be identified would be the presence of callous and unemotional traits. And in terms of an actual diagnosis, the closest diagnosis would be conduct disorder with limited prosocial emotions. And the reason that specifier is important and something I want to highlight is that not all children, and in fact, the majority of children diagnosed with conduct disorder are not displaying precursors of psychopathy. And then in adults, there's an increasing focus on not labeling a person as a psychopath, but rather referring to the presence of psychopathic traits. And like other traits, psychopathic traits exist on a spectrum. So this psychopathy is a spectrum disorder, meaning it's like has an entire range of severity. And then only because this is a question that kind of commonly comes up, the term sociopath, like sociopath or sociopathy is not a clinical or a scientific term. What it is an outdated term that is sometimes still used by the public or by media, but it's not something that's used by scientists or by mental health professionals. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then in case anyone is interested in learning more, psychopathyis.org is a place that I would recommend as a starting place. Obviously, you can't trust everything that's on the internet, but this is actually a reputable organization that's run by leading researchers in the field of psychopathy, and it's focused on providing evidence-based information that's geared towards the general public. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about some of the previous research that I've done, and then move into talking about some of the current research and future research that I have planned. So thinking about what are some of the potential underlying factors that are driving the expression of some of these traits and behaviors, Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory can be informative. And what this is a theoretical framework that identifies multiple motivational systems. Those systems are known as the behavioral inhibition system, or BIS, the behavioral activation system, or BAS, and then the fight, flight, or freeze system, which is focused on threat detection and avoidance. The BAS system, or the activation system, is focused on seeking out positive rewards from the environment And then the inhibition system is focused on balancing this conflict between trying to reach goals while also engaging in avoidance behavior as necessary. So this is related to psychopathy because one hypothesis regarding the development and causes of psychopathy is what's known as the low fear hypothesis. And basically this says that a deficit in fear is responsible for some of the deviant behaviors that are displayed by people high in psychopathic traits. And prior to this distinction being made between BIS and the FFFS system, so previously those were viewed as one and then got separated into two systems. But since their separation, it's been hypothesized that a weak BIS and a strong BAS were possibly explaining some of the things that we see with people who display psychopathic traits. And some evidence supporting that a weak BIS is related to the emotional detachment that's present in psychopathy, and a strong BAS is related to the disinhibition behavior component of psychopathy. So to look into the relationship between psychopathic traits and the reinforcement sensitivity theory, looked at a sample of inmates, males and females, and included measures of psychopathy, externalizing behavior, and these RST systems using self-report measures, and then use zero order correlations to look at the relationship between these various self-report measures that were just mentioned. And any of the BIS, BAS, or FFFS scales that were found to be significantly associated with psychopathy at that zero order level, so at that first correlational level, were then included as mediators in a path model, with psychopathy being the predictor and externalizing behavior being the outcome or the criterion. And what we found was that higher overall psychopathy scores, so that's what's represented by the PPI. The PPI is a self-report measure of psychopathy, were associated with lower levels of fear scores, the FFFS, and then that resulted in greater levels of externalizing behavior. So this does add some preliminary support to understanding it adds some support to the idea of this low fear hypothesis in psychopathy. So it fits with models that emphasize insensitivity to punishment as being one of the explanatory reasons for psychopathic traits and behaviors. And then I've also done some research looking at the roles of hormones, specifically cortisol and testosterone, in psychopathy, and particularly in callous and unemotional traits, or early precursors to psychopathy in adolescence. And just briefly, so cortisol comes from the HPA axis, and it's a response to unpredictability and any anticipated negative consequences. So cortisol is generally associated with inhibited behavior, avoidant behavior, withdrawal behavior. So similar to like the BIS system that we were just talking about with inhibition, we can kind of think about this as like the braking system in a car. And then the HPG axis produces testosterone, which is generally released in preparation for challenges and is often associated with extroversion, impulsivity, sensation seeking, and just general approach or goal-oriented behavior. And the amygdala, which processes fear, and we've talked about fear having a role in psychopathy, is sensitive to both of these hormones. And given that they have generally opposing effects, with testosterone being, if we were to put it in kind of simplified to overly simplified terms, we think of testosterone as kind of being like the gas and cortisol being like the brakes. They have these opposing effects. So is it possible that having extreme levels of one hormone that are not counteracted by the other would result in an increase in some of the traits and behaviors we see in psychopathy? So the idea is that a high ratio of testosterone alongside a low ratio of cortisol might be associated with psychopathy, whereas having high or low levels of one that are counterbalanced by relatively normal levels of the other would potentially be protective against psychopathy, but that extremes in opposite directions on both would be potentially more likely to result in these behaviors. And there's been some mixed research supporting that idea, particularly in adults. There's been, even in adults, that research has been a bit mixed. And within adolescents, there is a lot less evidence supporting that. So my goal was to see if that extended downward into adolescence, since we know that psychopathy tends to not just show up for the first time as an adult, but rather develop over time. So for this study, there were 200 adolescents that participated. 71 of them were male. They were high school students, so they ranged in age from 14 to 18. And what we expected to find was that higher testosterone to cortisol ratios would be predictive of psychopathic traits, and that would be the case regardless of any main effects of cortisol or testosterone. And then what we did to study that was went to high school classrooms on 2 separate days. And the first day we were there, collected a saliva sample. That was the first sample. And also collected self-report information on demographics and then potential covariates. So particularly with cortisol, it has a natural way that it ranges throughout the day. It follows a circadian rhythm. And so things like the number of hours slept, the time that, like how long a student had been awake, food that had been eaten and how recently. And then hormones also differ based on gender. So gender and pubertal development. So we looked at puberty development in both males and females. And for females, we also asked about their menstrual cycle. Then on the second day, we collected another sample that kind of represented not a true baseline as in a baseline of the time that they woke up that day, but a baseline for prior to any sort of intervention on our part. And then that was followed by a 5-minute pop quiz that was administered by their classroom teacher. So for all intents and purposes, was believed to be kind of an important part of their classroom experience. And that was intended to serve as a mild stressor. They completed questionnaires for about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the length of time available in the class. But that 15 to 20 minutes, hormones are relatively slow acting since they travel through the bloodstream. So it takes about 15 to 20 minutes for from the time of the stressor to see increases as a result of that stressor. And during that time, they were filling out some questionnaires for us. And then another saliva sample was taken. And then after another 20 minutes, which is when we would expect that hormone levels would return to approximately pre-intervention levels, another saliva sample was taken, the third one that day and the fourth one overall. So what that looked like on the second day we were there was basically take a sample, pop quiz, which is the stressor, 20 minutes after the pop quiz, take another sample, and then 20 minutes later, when hormone responses would have theoretically returned to baseline, take a third sample for that day. So we were looking at a lot of different variables here. So the baseline levels of cortisol and testosterone, which would have been sample 1 and sample 2. So the first samples taken on the 2 separate days averaged. And then the area under the curve, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Some ratios that previous research has found to be important. And then in terms of our psychopathy variables, we were looking at both the YPI and this is my mistake, but I don't see it listed here. Also the inventory of callous and unemotional traits. So both the YPI, the youth psychopathic traits inventory, and the ICU are measures of callous and unemotional traits in adolescents. I mentioned the area under the curve. So what we were looking at here was 2 forms of area under the curve. So if you remember, we took those 3 samples on the second day, and there are 2 ways of considering this area under the curve. There's area under the curve with respect to increase. And so area under the curve with respect to increase in this image you're looking at here is just the green portion only. So it's ignoring baseline levels or starting points and only taking into account the response following the stressor. So obviously, if somebody increased, if there were like a greater increase following the stressor, then the area under the curve would be greater. And then for the area under the curve with respect to ground, that takes into account how high somebody's baseline levels of cortisol or testosterone were to start with. So the area under the curve with respect to ground is measuring the total hormonal output, taking into account both the change and their previous levels of hormones, whereas the area under the curve with respect to increase is only looking at the change. So a quick summary of what we found is that none of the hormonal measures that we predicted, none of the hormonal measures that we were looking at predicted total psychopathy scores for either of our psychopathy measures. And there were a few subscales that were associated with hormonal measures, but those kind of have to be taken with a grain of salt because they were pretty small effect sizes. And they were found within overall models that were otherwise not significant. But just to quickly mention those, the area under the curve with respect to ground, so that would be the total hormonal output for cortisol, was associated with callousness and unemotionality in males. And then the cortisol with respect to increase, so that area under the curve that's only taking into account change, for females seem to be associated with callousness and unemotionality. But based on this, some kind of future directions, things that I would like to do is reanalyze that same data that we were just talking about, that hormonal data, but using a person-centered analyses. So this would involve latent profile analysis that would classify participants into groups based on how they responded, their hormonal response to the stressor. And I think it would be easier to show you what I'm talking about than try to describe it. So what we were theoretically expecting, right, is that there would be a stressor, hormone would increase, and then it would return to baseline. But we can imagine other patterns that participants would have followed, and we're looking at some of those here. So not everybody followed that expected pattern. So the opposite could have occurred where the stressor was experienced, and then for whatever reason, hormone levels dropped and then returned back to baseline. or we could imagine a situation where there was relatively no change following the stressor, or where hormonal responses increased following the stressor, and then rather returning to baseline continued to increase, or the opposite, where for whatever reason following the stressor, hormonal output decreased and then continued to decrease. And so what these person-centered analyses would be doing would be looking at differences in callous and emotional traits that are associated with these unique groups based on their hormonal responses, if that makes sense. Other research that I am starting and kind of continuing to move into is some research on public perception. So specifically public perception of incarcerated individuals and criminal justice policies. So some questions that I'd be interested in asking are, what is the general public's knowledge of laws and policies that are related to sentencing? And how does the public view the overall purpose of incarceration? Because there are some theories in the literature about different purposes that incarceration can have. And how good of a job do people in general believe that the criminal justice system is at carrying out these different potential purposes? And do their perceptions change if they're presented with information that contradicts their previously held beliefs? And are there individual differences that can predict whether current beliefs are more or less amenable to change? And I've gotten a chance to start doing some kind of a pilot version of some of this with an undergraduate student who's doing an honors thesis project, Kimberly Ingold, on solitary confinement. And what she's looking at is examining knowledge of beliefs about solitary confinement, and is specifically by having participants answer a series of questions that assess both their knowledge of solitary confinement and their beliefs about solitary confinement. And then after they've answered those questions, exposing them to a very brief, so 2 to 5 minute intervention, where they would, in the experimental condition, either read written information on solitary confinement or watch a video of a person discussing their experience of solitary confinement, compared to a control condition where people would be reading just general information about the correctional system that isn't specific to solitary confinement, and then answering those same sets of questions related to knowledge and beliefs a second time. And the hypothesis is that both experimental conditions would result in increased knowledge about solitary confinement and a less favorable opinion of solitary confinement, whereas those changes are expected to not be seen in that control condition. Also related to the hormonal data that I was talking about from earlier, one other possibility is that the 5-minute pop quiz that was administered to students may or may not have been an effective stressor for them, or it may have been an effective stressor for some, but not for all of them. And so I'm also interested in 2 different aspects of stressors. One, are there individual differences in how people are interpreting stressors that are presented to them? And 2, like identifying some reliable and useful stressor tasks that still retain a lot of ecological validity. So some stressor tasks that have a decent amount of research supporting their use and effectiveness don't really very closely mirror situations that would be likely to be encountered in real life. And so I think it would be useful to identify some real world stressors that can reliably activate either a challenge or a stress response for individuals. And then this idea about there being potential individual differences in how people respond to a stressor comes from when we were talking about testosterone and cortisol. Testosterone is generally released in response to trying to overcome a challenge, whereas cortisol would be released in response to feeling like you're in a threatening situation that needs to be avoided. And so would people with potentially more dominant personality traits be more likely to view stressful situations as a challenge to be overcome rather than a threat? And would that result in an increased testosterone response as opposed to an increased cortisol response? And then finally, I would like to move into some intervention research, which would ideally involve partnering with an area prison, jail, or probation office, looking at essentially, are there brief interventions that can have an effect in terms of real world behavior, and particularly comparing outcomes for individuals who would participate in a mindfulness-based intervention group compared to individuals who do not receive this mindfulness-based intervention. And if we think back to when we were talking about psychopathy earlier on, impulsivity is an important feature, particularly of that lifestyle facet that's associated with antisocial behavior. And so knowing that disinhibition and impulsivity are associated with externalizing behavior, is it possible to use something like a mindfulness-based intervention to encourage a little bit of a space between having an impulse or having a thought to act and actually taking action? And then following up on that, if there was a change in reactivity following this type of intervention, would that also be reflected in hormonal responsivity to a stressor? So I am going to stop there and open it up for any questions that people have. But if you have questions later on, I put my information there. I think most of you know where to find me.